Whenever I start finding myself writing a lot of imperative code in a directive in the linking function, particularly code that watches a model value or handles click events, or any event where there's already a built-in Angular directive, I start to ask myself why I'm not doing this with a template instead, because a template, I've found, often makes this code much easier to write, much easier to read, and often provides a nicer user experience because you can have your HTML and CSS designers come in and work on the file. It's much easier for them to do that there than it is inside of JavaScript code. So let's define a template. It will be rating.html. And quite often when I have a template, I'm also going to have a controller. So let's call this the OTF rating controller. And I would generally put this controller into a different file, but to keep things simple and everything on one screen, I'm just going to add it to the same file. What I'm hoping to do is get rid of my scope.watch. I will use binding expressions in the template instead, and also get rid of this click event handler. I will use ngClick instead and simply call something on the scope that is set up by my controller. So let's just define that controller real quick. This will be a function. I will expect it to take a scope object for reasons that I'll tell you about in just a bit. But just so you know, that scope object is going to be the same scope object that the linking function gets, the isolated scope that is set up by this directive. And I just need to make sure that I register this, which I can do with module.controller. So there's two things I want to talk about. First of all, why am I taking a scope in this controller? And that's because I really believe the controller for a directive, it serves two purposes. One is the traditional role of a controller, which is to set up the model for the view. And I will do that by attaching things to scope. For instance, I know I'm going to have some sort of click event from my template, and that will need to call something here in the model. So I will have it call the click method that's on my scope object. However, the other purpose of a directive, a controller in a directive, is quite often you want this controller to expose an API, and this API can be available to other directives and even to the same directive. So what I do is the API for this controller that is going to be used from other JavaScript code inside of directives or other controllers, that API I'm going to attach to the controller instance itself. So I will add this initialize method to this. And then there's the model, which I will attach to scope, and that keeps these two nicely separated. And then where will I use this controller? Well, that's the second thing I wanted to talk about. This linking function, I think its real job is still to link together the scope and the DOM. And so what I want the linking function to do is to dig out attribute values and just generally set things up in the environment so that the controller can then take over. And the controller can take over if I can just get a reference to it and call that initialize method. So the question is, how does the linking function get a reference to this controller? It does that by adding a require to the directive definition. I'm going to require OTF rating controller. Actually, I'm just going to require OTF rating, so that's asking for the directive OTF rating, and Angular will dig out the controller for that directive, which is myself, and pass it in as the parameter after attributes. You can require multiple controllers here, but we just need one, the controller for ourself. Angular will grab that controller, pass it in here. I can call controller.initialize, and I can actually tell it what these min and max values are. So now I have a controller in place. Let's go over and work on the template a bit. I will still want to display a series of stars, and I will do that by having spans with classes of glyph icon star. But I want to change the behavior a little bit from what we just had. The behavior I want now is that I want a series of stars that range from the minimum value to the maximum value. So if the rating goes from 1 to 5, I want a series of 5 stars. But if max is 10, I want a series of 10 stars. And then only some of those stars will be filled in. We'll fill in the number of stars up to the value of the rating that we are displaying. And all this means is that instead of having individual span elements here, I'm going to need to ng repeat on something, or basically from min to max. And the problem with ng repeat is there's no good way in Angular to tell ng repeat to just go from 0 to 5, or from 1 to 10. You really have to repeat over a collection. And so what I could do is inside of the controller, when we initialize it with min and max values, is we could create a collection. So I could add a stars property to my scope and just create an array that goes from max minus min plus 1. So that will create an array of n elements, but there's nothing really in that array. And the next problem I would face with Angular is that when you use an ng repeat and you repeat over something like star in that stars collection from my scope, Angular really wants to see distinct values inside of there. So distinct object references or distinct number values or distinct strings. We just have an array with empty elements inside. And in order for that to work with ng-repeat, I need to tell Angular to track these elements by index instead of the values that are inside of the elements. So this will create that series of spans for me. And then I need to figure out if they're going to be empty stars or filled in stars. What I can do is use the ng class directive to tell Angular to call a method on my model called styles. I'll pass in the index, and that method will tell you what styles to apply. We'll look at that in just a second. We'll build that. I'm also going to go ahead and add my ng click directive. I can just call click and pass in the index. And then to make this a bit fancier, let's add mouse over and mouse out events to color the stars differently if the mouse is over a particular star. So ng mouse over and ng mouse out. Both of those will need an index. And now I believe my template is complete. I just need to fill in some details in my controller for the click, the styles, the mouse over, and the mouse out. So first let's handle click. I know that gets an index. And one simple bit of logic that I could put in here is to simply say scope.value equals that index that you gave me, and I'll add 1. Now if someone sets a minimum value other than 1, we might need some additional logic in here, but I'll leave that as an exercise for you, the viewer. I'm just going to try to get something basic working. Let's also set up scope.mouseover. That will be a function that also takes index. And now what I want to do with mouse over and mouse out is basically remember the state of where the user's mouse is. So let me set up another variable on my scope during initialize. I'll call it preview, and I'll initialize it to -1, which means the user is not highlighting anything. But when there's a mouse over, I'll just say scope.preview equals that index. Now my scope object knows where the mouse is. And of course, if someone does a mouse out, all I really need to do is when you mouse out of a star, I'll set the preview back to -1. And of course, the user might mouse out of one star and mouse over right into the next star, but this logic should work. The last bit I'm going to need is that piece that computes the styles for a given index. Now, the way the ng-style directive works is that you can basically return an object, a hash, and Angular will inspect every property on that object. Property is truthy. Angular will take that property name and add it to the class attribute for that element. So by saying glyph icon true, I can be sure that glyph icon will always be a class on each span. Now I might also want glyph icon -star to be present, but I only want that to happen if the current index is less than scope.value. And yes, I have a real problem spelling glyph icon. But remember, this scope is the same scope that we're using in the linking function. It's our isolated scope, and this value is bound to an expression that the outside view has given us. So we can assume that will point to the employee rating in this scenario. So this will fill in the stars up to the rating value. I also want glyph icon star empty for stars that are above the rating. So that would be where index is greater than or equal to scope.value. And then to provide the little preview effect, I already have a class defined in site.css called star preview. What this will do is set a slightly transparent yellow color for any DOM element where that class name appears. So let's set up star preview to be there anytime index is less than or equal to scope.preview, which is the property that we're using to track mouse over and mouse out. So with all that in place, let me save everything, come back to the application, do a refresh. And now I can see that everyone has 5 stars, but not everyone has 5 stars filled in because not everyone has a rating of 5. But let's give someone a rating of 5. And we can see that our mouse over effect also works. And now I just need to click on a star to change a rating. And the code that I have now, I think, is a lot simpler than the code that I had before. The code that I had before had to worry about using scope.apply. It had to worry about watching model values. All of that's really been stripped away now. It's handled by binding expressions. So anytime the value changes, our classes will be reevaluated. And anytime the user clicks, we'll just call a simple method on our controller. And this is how I would prefer to implement this type of directive.